Today, we're taking a look at a couple of aircraft that represented the end of an era for the United States Navy, the Grumman F2F and the Grumman F3F. The F3F would in fact become the last biplane fighter to fully enter military service with American forces, and its time in its intended role was relatively brief. But these two aircraft were nonetheless very important. Designed for use aboard aircraft carriers, they served as the training platform for many US naval pilots, some of whom would go on to serve in the Second World War, whilst others would use their knowledge and experience to train the next generation of pilots, as well as develop advanced carrier fighter tactics. They were also incredibly iconic, representing a brief but vibrant time when US military aircraft were a kaleidoscope of colour. Bright yellow wings, shining silver bodies, and often trimmed in other colours that made them look more like aerobatic aircraft rather than military units. In essence, they were the quintessential image of 1930s US military aircraft. The origins of the F2F and F3F can be traced back to 1932. This was a period where the US Navy was confronted with fairly tight budget restraints. And although this situation would be reversed in just a few short years, the US Navy was not blessed with the gifts of foresight, and so they were looking for ways to manage costs. One of the easiest ways of doing this was to reduce airframe losses incurred by training accidents or mechanical failure, and for their carrier aircraft, an emphasis was placed on recoverability at sea. At the end of the 1920s, the Navy's interest had been piqued by a design from the Hull Aluminium Company. The XFH-1 had an all-metal, watertight structure that was capable of keeping the aircraft afloat for a considerable amount of time after ditching. Unfortunately, the aircraft itself proved disappointing during its 1929 evaluations, but the concept of keeping an aircraft afloat after ditching was of great interest to the Bureau of Aeronautics. As a stopgap measure, numerous aircraft were fitted with rapidly inflatable flotation bags, and while these did technically work, their true effectiveness was marginal at best. Because of this, the desire for a watertight flotation compartment was included in discussions between the Bureau and Grumman in the early 1930s. Although the two-seat Grumman FF-1 had not yet even entered production, and although the Boeing F-4B had just entered service, the US Navy was already looking for a replacement. In response to this, Grumman submitted a design known internally as the G8. It was a small, single-seat biplane fighter with an enclosed cockpit, and a retractable landing gear system similar to that found on the existing FF-1. Power was to be provided by a 625 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1535-44 Twin Wasp Jr., and the estimated performance of the aircraft was expected to be much greater than that of either the FF-1 or the F-4B. Additionally, the aircraft included two innovative features, one of which being the desired watertight fuselage compartment. The other was the installation of a fully adjustable horizontal stabilizer, which would allow the pilot to trim the aircraft in all flight conditions. Impressed with the potential of the G8, the Bureau ordered a single prototype under the designation of XF2F-1 on November 2, 1932. Later that month, Grumman moved to new facilities in Farmingdale, New York, and production of the prototype got underway. The construction of the XF2F-1 drew heavily on the company's prior experience with the FF-1. The entire structure of the aircraft was made from aluminium. The fuselage was also skinned in aluminium, but the wings and control surfaces were still fabric covered. The all-metal semi-monocoque fuselage was 21 feet 3 inches long, and like on the previous FF-1, the landing gear still retracted into the fuselage just forward of the lower wing. Construction of the XF2F-1 was complete in October of 1933, and on the 9th it made its first flight. It was then delivered to NAS Anacostia on the 18th of October to begin its flight trials. The trials revealed that the prototype had excellent performance. The aircraft had a top speed of 229 miles an hour and a rate of climb of 3,080 feet per minute. But it was also revealed that the aircraft had poor directional stability due to its short fuselage. Because of this, the aircraft had the unfortunate tendency to easily enter unintentional spins, and although steps would be taken to address this, it was a problem that would continue to persist throughout its operational life. Following the initial trials, several small changes were made to the prototype to satisfy the requests made by Navy evaluators. As originally delivered, the prototype had a smooth engine cowling. This was changed to a smaller diameter cowling, featuring blisters over the rocker arms to allow for proper rocker arm clearance. Additionally, the oil cooler and oil cooler intake were modified, the intake changing shape from square to round, and finally, a large antenna mast was installed just forward of the vertical fin, and a telescopic gun sight was installed as well. With these changes, the aircraft continued the flight test program, and on the 17th of May 1934, the Navy placed an order for 54 production units as the F2F-1. Meanwhile, the prototype would remain in service until 1938, when it was written off in an accident at NAS Anacostia. The first production F2F-1 was delivered to the Navy on the 28th of January 1935. The production F2F-1 differed from the prototype in a number of ways. The engine was replaced with a Pratt & Whitney R1535-72. The cowling shape was modified slightly again, as was the canopy. The carburetor intake was also changed, and the antenna mast on the fuselage spine was deleted. The armament now consisted of two 30 caliber machine guns in the fuselage, firing through the propeller arc, and there was provision for two 100-pound bombs to be mounted on underwing racks. Production of the aircraft was complete by August of 1935. VF-2B was the first squadron to transition to the aircraft, and they were soon followed by VF-3B, which would later be renamed V5 to correspond with the hull number of their carrier, USS Yorktown. Though it would see use with up to 6 squadrons at various points, the F2F-1 was primarily used by just those aboard the US carriers Lexington, Yorktown, and Ranger, whose F2Fs then transferred over to the USS Wasp. Its service life, like many other US naval aircraft at the time, was quiet, often mundane, but still highly important. The F2Fs provided a platform for many naval pilots to learn their trades, and they featured in most major exercises and fleet problems during the late 1930s. The F2F proved to be surprisingly rugged, being able to easily take the rough handling of inexperienced pilots, though, like other carrier aircraft, its landing gear and tailhook still struggled with particularly fast or rough landings, as evidenced by several videos of landing accidents during this time. The concept of the F2F's watertight hull was also proven during this time, with several aircraft going into the drink and staying afloat long enough to be salvageable. A good example of this was an F2F from USS Yorktown, which went into the sea in 1938, but after recovery continued to be used until October of 1941. The F2Fs that got the most use were those used by the so-called Flying Chiefs of VF-2B. During 1938 and 1939, every aircraft in the squadron won back-to-back excellence awards in gunnery contests. This was the first time a squadron had held the honour 2 years in a row, and it was both a testament to the skills of the pilots and the reliability of the F2F as an excellent gunnery platform. Though they were generally well liked by their crews, the F2F was never viewed as being perfect, and because of this, it was retired from frontline squadrons as soon as newer replacements were available. By the end of 1941, the F2F could only be found within a few fighter training units, or more commonly, in a dusty hangar being used as an instructional airframe for ground crews. In consequence of this, no examples of the F2F survive today, and to be honest, not a great deal is known about them either. I can count on one hand the number of books that cover them in any sort of detail. Not a lot has been written on, or discussed about, the Grumman biplanes in general in recent years, so you'd need to read some older books to get the full picture. Now, finding said books is pretty easy nowadays, thanks to the prevalence of online shopping platforms, but that also brings with it some unfortunate risks, which is why I want to quickly talk about Incogni, the sponsor of today's video. Pretty much everywhere you go online, your data is being collected. A lot of this data, names, aliases, login details, and even things like tax file numbers or social security, or whatever it's called wherever you live, is being bought and sold by some not so wonderful entities known as data brokers. They are the reason why, after say, Googling for new book scanning equipment, you spend the next month being spammed by emails, advertisements, and even phone calls from various office supply companies, none of which, by the way, were useful, and the phone call interrupted a 1-hour recording session, and yes, I'm still mad about it. Unfortunately, there isn't much to prevent your data being sold to the wrong sort of people, and while you do have the right to request the brokers delete the data they hold on you, going through all these requests yourself could literally take years, and this is where Incogni comes in. Incogni reaches out to these various data brokers on your behalf and gets them to remove said data, so you don't have to deal with a billion phone calls from a shady call center telling you things like, "Oh, we can fix your slow internet." I live in Australia, that's already a lost cause. Thankfully, getting set up with Incogni is incredibly easy. You just create an account, tell Incogni what personal details you want removed, grant them permission to do so on your behalf, and then sit back as it does the work for you. Incogni also repeatedly follows up with said brokers, as they like to harvest your data at multiple intervals, and will spam them just as much as the broker's clients would like to spam you. So to try it out, you can head to incogni.com/Hangar, or click on the link below and use the code HANGAR, and the first 100 people to do so will get 60% off their Incogni purchase. So thank you Incogni for sponsoring today's video and getting rid of my irritating spam calls. And now, let's get back to the Grumman biplanes. Though the F2F had a relatively short-lived service life, its successor, the F3F, fared a little better. In fact, by interwar standards, it did rather well. On the 15th of October 1934, with the delivery of the first production F2F-1s still over 3 months away, Grumman was awarded a contract to build a prototype of their new Model 11. In reality, it was not really a new design at all, but rather an improved Model 8, one that incorporated some modifications to correct the problems with instability that were encountered in the F2F-1. But instead of being designated as the F3F-2, as would have been logical, the prototype would receive the naval designation of F3F-1 instead. At a glance, the prototype looked like a stretched-out F2F, and that's because it was. The fuselage had been lengthened by approximately 21 inches, and it also had slightly larger wings, coming in with a new wingspan of 32 feet. But aside from that, there were not many changes. The power plant and armament was identical to that of the F2F, and the layout of the cockpit appeared to have remained virtually unchanged as well. Minor changes could be found in the main wheels, which had slightly different dimensions, and the carburetor intake was moved to a different location on the port side of the fuselage. But that was about as different as things got. The prototype flew for the first time on the 20th of March 1935, with Grumman test pilot Jimmy Collins at the controls. His initial reports on the aircraft were favourable, claiming that it was exceptionally manoeuvrable, but tragically, this would have dire consequences just 2 days later. During dive tests, indeed at the end of the final terminal velocity dive of the day, Collins pulled out of a dive at 8,000 feet at an astonishingly sharp angle. The aircraft subsequently disintegrated, with both wings and the engine coming apart from the airframe, and Collins was killed on impact with the ground. After recovery and inspection of the surviving equipment, it was found that the prototype had supposedly pulled 14G, forces that the airframe simply couldn't handle. A second prototype was quickly completed. Externally, it looked identical to the first, though it did feature reinforcements to the lower wing fuselage fittings, as well as the engine mounts. Unfortunately, the benefits of these upgrades were never realized, as this second prototype was lost almost as quickly as the first. This time the culprit was an unrecoverable flat spin, which, ironically, happened during spin trials where Grumman was trying to prove that the prototype could now actually recover from said event happening. This time though, the test pilot, Lee Gelbach, survived as he was able to bail out at around 2,000 feet. Following this, a third XF3F-1 was built, and apparently third time was the charm, as the saying goes, because this one actually survived its testing period. This prototype was completed within a matter of weeks, partly because there were a large number of undamaged parts that could be salvaged from the second prototype. This third aircraft featured an enlarged rudder to improve spin recovery, as well as the previously mentioned reinforcements to the lower wing and engine mounts. While not installed on the third prototype, it was decided that the production aircraft would use an updated version of the engine, the R1535-84. Additionally, the propeller, which until this point had been built by Lycoming Smith, was changed to a variable pitch two-blade Hamilton standard. These changes would add around 43 pounds of additional weight, and to ensure this was factored into testing, the prototype had a lead-filled steel tube bolted onto the crankcase to simulate the added weight. As the crashes of the previous two prototypes had somewhat delayed things, flight testing for the third was given absolute priority. Because of this, only 2 months would pass between the first flight of the third prototype and the ordering of 54 production F3F-1s in August of 1935. Ironically, this third and final prototype would have one of the longest service lives of the entire type. It was used for flight testing until March of 1936, after which it went to NAS Anacostia as a station aircraft, and it was still being used as an advanced fighter trainer at NAS Miami in 1943. Delivery of the F3F-1s began in January of 1936, and the last aircraft was delivered in September of the same year. Aside from the changes to the engine and the propeller unit, the only other major difference between these aircraft and the prototype was the armament, with the starboard 30 caliber machine gun being replaced by a larger 50 caliber weapon. Unlike the F2F, the F3F would see a longer production run, and it would be built in multiple variants, and this was for a number of reasons. The US Navy was going through a massive expansion program in the late 1930s, which meant more carriers, and thus more carrier fighters. Other fighter programs were soon to prove disappointing, or at least encounter major delays in their development, and Grumman itself would iterate its design to try and solve various structural and stability problems. Very early on, a string of accidents made it abundantly clear that the reinforcements made to the airframe of the F3F-1 was not enough. During the summer of 1936, mere months into its service, all F3F-1s were restricted to maneuvers that pulled no greater than 6G. A single production airframe was then taken to the Naval Aircraft Factory for testing, and as a result of the testing, the upper wing beam and the aileron bell cranks were strengthened on all subsequent F3F models. And this was also retrofitted to all existing F3F-1s as well. Gradually, the F3Fs were cleared to higher G limits again, as things were gradually tested, eventually being permitted up to 9 Gs. With their early weakness eliminated, they quickly gained a reputation for being able to pull off various aerobatic stunts, something that made a few variants of the aircraft very famous later on. Quickly following the F3F-1 was the F3F-2. This was actually a result of the development that would eventually lead to the F4F Wildcat. Initially, Grumman had developed the Model 16, which was ordered as the F4F-1 prototype. This was to be their next generation of fighter aircraft, but when Brewster was awarded a contract for their F2A, a monoplane design, Grumman realized it had to produce a monoplane as well. This argument was then further strengthened by the fact that taking one of the proposed engines from the F4F-1, the Wright Cyclone, and sticking it in the existing F3F, gave the F3F almost identical performance anyway. And so, the Navy agreed to Grumman both developing a more modern monoplane fighter, as well as updating its existing fleet of biplanes to fill the gap for the time being. The final F3F-1 from the production line was thus converted over to the F3F-2 prototype. It was modified to take the 865 horsepower Wright 1820 G5 Cyclone, which came with a 2-speed supercharger. The installation required a redesign of the forward fuselage to accept the larger diameter engine, and the two-blade Hamilton standard propeller was changed for a larger three-blade unit. Despite the increased size of the fuselage and the increased weight, when the prototype first flew in July of 1936, it boasted an improved top speed of 255 miles an hour and an increased service ceiling of 30,200 feet. Though the performance was better, flight trials were delayed by numerous problems with the carburetors, as well as a tendency for the oil to overheat. Additionally, poor airflow in the cockpit led to the frequent accumulation of carbon monoxide, which pilots found to be particularly disagreeable. Following some adjustments, flight testing resumed, and on the 23rd of March 1937, the Navy placed an order for 81 production aircrafts as the F3F-2. Just 4 months later, the first of these were delivered to Dann.R.S. and Anacostia for service tests. It featured a newer and enlarged rudder to compensate for the increased engine torque, as well as a redesigned canopy and windshield. Unfortunately, both the oil cooling and carbon monoxide problems presented themselves again in short order, and the introduction of the type was delayed until November of 1937. The second F3F-2 was modified to eliminate both of the aforementioned problems. A larger oil cooling unit was installed, being placed in a fairing below the fuselage, as opposed to the older, smaller unit which had been in the cowling, and the carbon monoxide problem was solved by rather sensibly installing inlets on the fuselage, just above the leading edge of the horizontal stabilizers, to force clean air into the cabin. With these problems eliminated, production was once again cleared, and the F3F-2s quickly began to take shape. This finalized version represented some significant changes from the original F3F-1. Not only was the power plant new, but the production aircraft now had the R1820-22 version, which is rated at 950 horsepower for takeoff. This gave the aircraft an improved top speed of 256 miles an hour, and the service ceiling was further increased from 30,200 feet to 32,400 feet. Range was also slightly increased, going from 882 to 975 miles under normal operations. Armament, however, would remain the same: one 30 caliber machine gun, one 50 caliber machine gun, and provision for 2 bombs of approximately 110 pounds under each wing. The first F3F-2s were delivered at the end of 1937, entering service with VF-6 aboard USS Enterprise. These were quickly followed by VMF-1 and VMF-2 of the Marine Corps, as well as VF-5, which received a partial complement in 1938. 1938 would also see the final military version of the aircraft come into being, the F3F-3. The summer of 1938 had brought unexpected difficulties for the US Navy with the development of both the Brewster F2A and the Grumman F4F. With the new carrier air groups needing to be formed, the Navy found itself on the cusp of a critical aircraft shortage. Grumman had somewhat predicted this. Not their own problems with the F4F, of course, but they had harboured doubts about the effectiveness of the Brewster, and they proposed a production run of so-called improved F3F-2s. Though the biplane was already obsolete by 1938, Grumman did its best to maximise the performance of the design, knowing full well that this was a stopgap measure anyway. They made several aerodynamic refinements. These included a redesigned wing leading edge, a tighter fitting cowling, deletion of the fuselage cooling vents, and a redesigned windshield. A production F3F-2 was selected to be modified into the XF3F-3, and it was rapidly completed and sent out for testing. This included visits to the wind tunnel at Langley, as well as multiple visits to the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia. Finally, in October of 1938, the prototype was delivered for service trials, which were completed by December the 14th, and just 2 days later, the first production F3F-3 was accepted by the Navy. 27 F3F-3s were built, and they were in fact so similar to the F3F-2 that they retained the same internal company designation of G-19. Most of them were assigned to VF-5 aboard USS Yorktown. A few went to VMF-2, VF-4, and VF-6 to supplement their numbers, and 2 were assigned to Dann.R.S. and Anacostia for training and testing. The service of the -2 and -3 variants within the fleet was about as brief as that of the F3F-1, with the Brewster F2A Buffalo and the Grumman F4F Wildcats beginning to enter service in 1940. The older biplanes were quickly retired, and by October of 1941, the last squadron operating the F3F-2s turned in their aircraft. Consequently, most of the F3F's work would be done as a training aircraft, with many being assigned to Training Command at NAS Miami and at NAS Corpus Christi. They also had a moment in the limelight when they featured in the wartime film Dive Bomber. This movie was an excellent example of how fast interwar aircraft were superseded. Many of the planes featured in this film were considered state-of-the-art by the standards of, say, 1937, but in 1941, when the film was released, they were already completely obsolete. And yet, despite being outclassed and replaced in near-record time, these Grumman biplanes have not fallen into obscurity, unlike many of their contemporaries. This was partly because of the so-called Gulf Hawks. The Gulf Oil Company, and its chief pilot, Al Williams, had been using a modified Curtiss Hawk to perform at various air shows and other public events. At some point around late 1935, they approached Grumman to build a stronger, faster, and more powerful replacement, and this resulted in the Grumman G-22. This essentially involved taking the designs of the F2F and F3F, mashing them together, and then pumping the resulting design full of steroids. All of the armament, bomb racks, and arrestor gear equipment was removed. The engine cowling was replaced with a custom piece designed by Al Williams himself. The smaller upper wing of the F2F was installed, and into this lightened, aerodynamically slimmed package, they installed a 1,000 horsepower Wright 1820 G1, which was modified to handle up to 30 minutes of inverted flight. The result of all of this was a biplane that had a top speed of just over 290 miles an hour, which for 1936 was suitably impressive. Named the Gulf Hawk II, Williams flew the aircraft in performances all over the country, where the aircraft served as both a platform for entertainment and for Gulf Oil to test and demonstrate various fuels, oils, lubricants, and equipment. But he also took it overseas as well. The Gulf Hawk II would feature at air shows in England, France, Germany, and Holland, and it was in Germany that Ernst Udet, a World War I flying ace, and an admirer of Williams' flying skills, would become the only other person permitted to fly Williams' Gulf Hawk. In return for this gesture, Williams was permitted to fly the brand new Messerschmitt Bf 109, becoming the first American pilot to do so. The Gulf Hawk II would fly for a remarkably long time, entertaining millions of people across hundreds of airshows between 1936 and 1948. During the Second World War, Williams toured various military bases with the aircraft, helping to inspire the next generation of pilots with his demonstrations. When Williams finally took delivery of his Gulf Hawk IV, a modified F-8F Bearcat, he presented the aircraft to the Smithsonian Institution, and today you can still find it on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It might have been joined as well by the Gulf Hawk III, which was a modified version of the F3F that was built in 1938. This came with a tandem cockpit, dual controls, and even trailing edge flaps. Yet, thanks to another 1,000 horsepower engine, it was actually faster than the naval version of the F3F. The Navy ended up making use of this aircraft during the Second World War. They bought it from Williams and used it as a utility aircraft and as a trainer. Unfortunately, it was eventually lost when a fuel pump failure sent it into the Everglades in Florida, and after recovery, it was found to be too damaged for repairs, and so it was scrapped. Happily, the Gulf Hawk II is not the only surviving example of Grumman's biplanes. There are 4 F3F-2s to be found today, as well as a replica of the Grumman G-32A, which was a civilian demonstrator variant of the F3F. They represent the last of Grumman's biplanes, and indeed they represent the end of biplane use within the US Navy. But the F2F and F3F had helped to further strengthen a strong relationship between Grumman and the Navy, and that would go from strength to strength with their new generation of monoplane fighters, starting with, of course, the F4F Wildcat. But the story of the Wildcat is one for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the patrons. For the next few months, I'll mostly be focusing on weekend uploads, with a Wednesday video being optional depending on my workload. I'll be providing more information in my first Rex Rambles video, which will be going up soon. And a big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier members. Sorry if things have been a bit quiet on the Patreon front this month. Some things have come up with my workload that have kind of thrown a spanner in the works. Some long-term projects have hit some major logistical roadblocks, and I'm having to sort of scurry about and fix things. Again, I'll be trying to give an update on everything in the Rex Rambles video, but there's only so much I can talk about at the moment just because I want to keep some things under wraps. But for the meantime, things should continue as normal with the weekend uploads. So until next time, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you all later. Goodbye.